In 1863, Ebenezer Cobb Morley walked into London's dimly lit Freemasons Tavern, expecting a civilized debate over the rules of a gentleman's sport. Instead, he found himself staring down a mob of furious, ale-soaked aristocrats, ready to spill blood over their God-given right to violently hack each other's shins. This was the moment a petty barroom brawl splintered the world's most popular sport in two, accidentally birthing a multi-billion-dollar empire. In this video, you'll see dried pig bladders used in village-wide street riots, Ivy League elites legalizing literal assault, and an arrogant rugby purist deploying the ultimate insult of French softness to unwittingly lay the groundwork for the NFL. We'll uncover the bizarre irony of how a game originally built entirely around kicking the ball was hijacked by a country that practically never uses its feet, infuriating the rest of the globe in the process. We researched the history of the 19th century athletic clubs to solve the ultimate sports question: why the world can't agree on what football actually is. To keep learning the true, gritty origins of football, subscribe. If you were a peasant living in medieval England, your existence was defined by relentless, back-breaking labor. The feudal system offered virtually no upward mobility. Famine was a constant neighbor, and disease routinely decimated entire populations. Life was short, harsh, and heavily regulated by the lords who owned the land you worked. Yet, once a year, right before the solemn fasting period of Lent, the endless toil was permitted to stop. The entire village would gather in the public square for Shrovetide, a festival that temporarily suspended the rigid social order. And the centerpiece of this festival was a game of absolute unhinged chaos. There were no carefully stitched leather balls in the 14th century. The equipment was entirely organic. The local butcher would extract the bladder from a slaughtered pig, inflate it with air, tie it off, and encase it in an animal skin to give it a semblance of weight. The playing field wasn't a manicured pitch. It was the entire geography of the town. The goal lines were simply the opposite ends of the village, sometimes miles apart, often marked by a local mill, a specific tree, or a riverbank. Once that pig bladder was tossed into the enormous crowd, the village erupted into a stampede. Hundreds of men surged through narrow cobblestone alleys, trampling carts, fences, and each other. There were no referees. There were no out-of-bounds lines. There was no limit on the number of players. Hitting, shoving, wrestling, and outright brawling were standard, accepted tactics. Players would routinely suffer broken limbs, gouged eyes, and severe concussions. If the ball happened to roll into a freezing river, the mob would dive in after it, sometimes resulting in accidental drownings in the crush of bodies. You could do almost anything short of outright murder to advance the ball toward the enemy parish. However, the ruling class despised this tradition. The sheer noise of hundreds of screaming peasants terrified the local aristocracy, who often feared these chaotic gatherings could easily pivot into an armed rebellion against the crown. In 1314, the Lord Mayor of London issued a decree on behalf of King Edward II, explicitly outlawing the game due to the great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls. A few decades later, King Edward III attempted to crush the tradition entirely. England was embroiled in the 100 Years' War, and the king was furious that his subjects were wasting their energy wrestling in the mud instead of practicing their mandatory archery skills. Royal decrees hold immense theoretical weight, but enforcing a ban on a mob of hundreds of desperate men looking for an outlet for their misery proved impossible. The street brawls survived the wrath of multiple kings, enduring for centuries. It wasn't until the industrialization of England and the passage of the Highway Act of 1835, which heavily criminalized playing games on public roads to make way for carriages and commerce, that the mob was finally forced to disperse. The ancient game was officially banished from the streets, but the sport did not die. It simply found a completely new, highly exclusive host. It migrated out of the peasants' villages and directly into the pristine courtyards of elite British boarding schools, where a new generation of privileged aristocrats were about to make the game infinitely more complicated. When the sons of British elite arrived at boarding schools like Eton, Rugby, and Charterhouse in the early 19th century, they brought the chaotic traditions of village football with them. But because these schools were completely isolated from one another, with no central governing athletic body, the boys began adapting the game to fit their specific environments. The architecture of the schools literally dictated the rules of the sport. At Eton College, space was highly restricted. The boys often played in narrow courtyards or right up against a large brick wall. Because running at full speed in a confined, stoned corridor was a guaranteed death sentence, the Eton boys evolved a game built almost entirely on finesse. They kept the ball strictly on the ground, forbidding players from picking it up, and focused heavily on precision kicking and dribbling. Over at the rugby school in Warwickshire, the environment was vastly different. The school boasted a sprawling green field. With endless room to maneuver, the boys had no incentive to keep the ball on the ground. The legend goes that in 1823, a student named William Webb Ellis simply caught the ball and, in a total disregard for traditional rules, sprinted forward with it in his hands. Whether the legend of Ellis is strictly true or not, the rugby school fully embraced this style. Their version of the sport demanded physical domination. Players were actively encouraged to tackle the ball carrier, wrestling him to the grass in a violent test of strength. This isolation created a crisis once these boys graduated. During the mid-1800s, graduates from Eton, Rugby, Harrow, and Winchester all converged at major universities like Cambridge and Oxford. Naturally, these young men wanted to continue playing their beloved game, and they began organizing intercollegiate matches on the university greens. The results were catastrophic. An Eton graduate would step onto the field expecting a gentlemanly kicking match. He would attempt to casually dribble the ball, only to get utterly flattened by a massive rugby alumnus who was playing by full contact tackling rules. Matches instantly dissolved into bare-knuckle fistfights because half the players genuinely believed the other half were cheating. An Eton man saw a player carrying the ball as a blatant violation of the sport, while a rugby man saw a player refusing to tackle as a coward. Various factions tried to fix the chaos. In 1848, representatives from several schools met at Trinity College, Cambridge, to nail down a unified set of rules. They spent hours arguing in dorm rooms, eventually producing the Cambridge Rules, which heavily favored the kicking game. But the document was an incredibly fragile compromise. Many of the heavy-hitting schools refused to adopt it, and the tribal warfare on the athletic fields continued to rage. The anarchy reached a breaking point by the early 1860s. A prominent London solicitor named Ebenezer Cobb Marley, who had founded the Barnes Football Club, realized the sport was eating itself alive. Every match his team played against a rival club ended in a bitter dispute over the rules. Morley, a man deeply rooted in the logic and structure of the law, decided the sport would completely cannibalize itself if someone didn't step in and force a centralized code of conduct. He decided to summon the leadership of every major athletic club in London, lock them in a room, and legislate a compromise. Morley assumed logic, reason, and a desire for gentlemanly order would win the day. He severely underestimated how much certain English gentlemen cherished the violence. On the evening of October 26, 1863, club representatives filed into the Freemasons' Tavern in London. The air was thick with pipe smoke and tension as the men gathered under the dim glow of gas lamps. Over endless jugs of ale, Ebenezer Cobb Morley stood at the head of the table and laid out his grand vision. He wanted to form a unified governing body. He wanted to standardize the size of the pitch, but most importantly, he wanted to heavily restrict the use of hands, outlaw running with the ball, and permanently ban the practice of hacking. Hacking was the incredibly brutal tactic of intentionally kicking an opposing player squarely in the shins to bring them down or force them to drop the ball. It was a staple of the rugby style of play, frequently resulting in deep lacerations, fractured bones, and blood-soaked socks. Morley argued that if the sport wanted to expand and become a respectable, organized pursuit for gentlemen, the intentional maiming of opponents had to stop. The rugby faction at the table was utterly furious. They saw Morley's proposal not as a refinement of the sport, but as an absolute emasculation of it. The loudest voice of opposition belonged to Francis Mall Campbell, the representative of the formidable Blackheath Club. Campbell was a fiercely proud man who viewed the physical damage of the game as a vital character-building exercise for the British Empire. He stood up in the smoky tavern and delivered a fiery, table-pounding defense of the violence. He argued that hacking was an essential, defining test of courage. Removing the physical danger, he claimed, would destroy the legendary pluck and resilience of the English gentleman. Campbell then looked directly at Morley and the kicking advocates and deployed the ultimate 19th century insult. He declared, "I think that if you do away with it, you will do away with all the pluck and dash of the game, and I will be bound to bring over a lot of Frenchmen who would beat you with a week's practice." Or in other words, he was a French softie. The tavern erupted. Chairs scraped against the floorboards as men shouted over one another. The meeting stopped being a debate about sports logistics and instantly transformed into a screaming match over national pride, masculinity, and honor. For the men of Blackheath and rugby, the violence wasn't a byproduct of the game. The violence was the game. Over the next month and a half, the association met 5 more times at the tavern, trying desperately to find a middle ground. It was completely useless. The divide was ideological, not mechanical. Finally, during the 6th meeting, a vote was called to officially adopt Morley's kicking-centric rules. Campbell demanded a delay, trying to rally more heavy-hitting clubs to his side. When his motion was defeated, Campbell dramatically announced that the Blackheath Club was withdrawing from the association immediately. He and his supporters turned their backs on Morley and walked out of the Freemasons Tavern forever. That single explosive moment in London permanently fractured the global athletic world. The men who stayed behind in the tavern formalized the Football Association, creating the highly regulated kicking-centric game the world now knows as soccer. Campbell and his hardliners went their own way, officially forming the Rugby Football Union 8 years later to protect their physical ball-carrying traditions. The kicking game created by Morley quickly swept across the globe, easily conquering Europe, South America, and Africa. But 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, a young, growing cultural power was watching the split. The elite universities of the United States looked at the peaceful, highly regulated game of soccer, outright rejected it, hijacked the violent rugby rules, and engineered a completely unprecedented spectacle. American colleges had their own dark, deeply ingrained history with mob football. Throughout the early 1800s, university administrators fought a losing battle against their own students over the game. Harvard University famously hosted an annual tradition on the Boston Common, known as Bloody Monday. It was nominally a ball game, but in reality, it was a chaotic, unregulated, bare-knuckle brawl between the freshman and sophomore classes. The violence was so severe and the destruction of local property so widespread that Harvard banned all forms of the sport in 1860. When organized intercollegiate sports finally began taking root on U.S. campuses after the Civil War, schools initially leaned toward the civilized kicking rules established by the English Football Association. The very first formal American college game was played in 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton. Hundreds of spectators sat on wooden fences to watch the two teams kick a round ball up and down a field. Players were strictly forbidden from carrying the ball or throwing it, but could still use their hands to swat the ball down. Rutgers won the match 6-4, and while the event was considered a novel success, it lacked the physical intensity that young American men craved, and Harvard University wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Harvard was the undisputed heavyweight champion of American academia, but their student body possessed a rough, aggressive streak. They refused to join the newly formed Intercollegiate Association because they despised the kicking rules. Instead, they developed their own unique variation called the Boston game. It allowed players to pick up the ball and run, bringing the intense physical collisions of Bloody Monday back into the light of day. In the spring of 1874, Harvard extended an invitation to McGill University, located north of the border in Montreal, for a 2-game series in Massachusetts. McGill accepted, but with a major stipulation. They played by strict English rugby rules. They agreed to play the first game under Harvard's Boston rules and the second game under McGill's rugby rules. Harvard tied the rugby match 0-0, but they walked off the field with a completely new obsession. Because Harvard held wide-reaching cultural and athletic influence, their obsession dictated the future of the continent. They immediately announced they would exclusively play a rugby-style running game. Yale, who had been successfully playing their soccer-style game, desperately wanted to play their bitter academic rival. To make the match happen, Yale was forced to bend the knee and accept Harvard's rugby rules. In 1875, the two titans clashed under the new format. Harvard won, but the sight of 2,000 spectators roaring at the crunching physical collisions proved that the running game was a financial and cultural goldmine. But American football as we know it today still hadn't arrived, and calling it football still made a lot of sense, even despite some uniquely American tweaks to the rugby rules. For instance, back then, it was illegal to throw the ball forward, and points could still only be scored by kicking. In fact, when a team would muscle and fight their way through the trenches to the end zone, they weren't rewarded with 6 points. They were simply given the opportunity to kick the ball into the field goal, as that was the only way to score. But as the American college game evolved in the late 1880s and 1890s, the offensive strategies devolved into absolute madness. Instead of kicking the ball, coaches realized they could exploit the rules by massing their players together. Teams began linking arms, locking their bodies together, and using themselves as giant human battering rams to push the ball carrier forward. The infamous flying wedge, pioneered by Harvard, literally required the entire team to get a sprinting start and crash into a single point on the defensive line. The game became a claustrophobic ground war. It was uniquely American, but it was coming at a terrifying cost, a cost that would force American football to rapidly diverge from its foot-oriented origins. Because as America entered the 20th century, their version of football had become a literal national crisis. The human battering rams weren't just causing broken collarbones and concussions. They were actively killing teenagers on the field. The bodies piled up so fast, with dozens of young men dying from spinal fractures and cerebral hemorrhages, that the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, had to step in with a terrifying ultimatum: fix the game or see it banned entirely. So, to save the sport from extinction, American rules committees had to invent a desperate, highly controversial rule change, one that would force players to spread out, permanently remove the foot as the primary offensive weapon, and birth the high-flying, billion-dollar aerial spectacle we watch today. But the story of America's final footballing evolution is for another video. Luckily, we've got it ready for you right here. Click the video on screen to hear how the forward pass changed everything for the American game. Or click this other video you might like. Let us know who you think is the real winner of the word football in the comments below. Thanks for watching.